My
Hello,
first,
hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Dumani Bahrami Rad. Hello, Duman, how are you doing?
good, thank you.
All right.
I'm honored to be your guest. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I'm elated that you feel esteemed that you're on my show. So sorry, I call you Dumani. Your name is Duman. I don't like to,
Duman,
yes, I do not like to
yes,
mispronounce a name. So we're going to get straight to business.
no problem.
So, Duman, you wrote a paper titled Keeping It in the Family. And we will
Yeah.
be discussing this paper today, Keeping It in the Family, Female Inheritance in Marriage and the Status of Women. So this is
Mm-hmm.
the first question, Duman.
Mm-hmm.
What is a
Yeah.
patrilineal society?
So patrilineal, it depends. We have patrilineal kinship and patrilineal inheritance, and these are two different things. So when we talk about patrilineal kinship, which is what I refer mostly in my paper, is where you identify yourself by one side of the family. For for most societies, it is the father's side of the family. So you take a father's family name and you identify yourself with father's side of the family. This patrilineal kinship developed in many societies because it makes it clearer to identify yourself at the time of dispute, for example. You just take side with your father's side of family, right? You're not confused whether you should take the side of the mother's side or father's side. So that is patrilineal kinship. For European societies, we have bilateral kinship. So people historically identified themselves by both father's side and mother's side. In some African societies, we also have bilateral kinship. But for Middle Eastern societies, for many Asian societies, it was just patrilineal kinship. Then we have patrilineal inheritance. Patrilineal inheritance is where the property of father is transferred to sons only. This is something different. In the paper I mentioned patrilineal society. I refer to patrilineal kinship, not inheritance.
All right. And your paper is about the labor force participation of women and inheritance law. So this is the second question. Can inheritance impede the labor force participation of women? And we're referring to
So
India.
yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about my paper. What is the main logic in my paper? Um, there's this there's this idea by development economists that if you promote female inheritance, that is transfer of property from fathers to women to daughters, that is an effective policy to empower women in developing countries. Um, but I developed a counterintuitive hypothesis from the literature that female inheritance laws might lead to constrained marriage and gender norms. Constraint marriage norm, I talk about cousin marriage. Constraint gender norms, I talk about reduced female economic participation. And when I claim it is about male-dominated societies like Asian, Middle Eastern countries, not today's modern Western societies. In these societies, women are mostly carriers of property from father to husband. They're not active managers of wealth. So the logic is like this. I'm going to tell the story and then we can take it on from there. When a woman inherits a parcel of land, her male relatives arrange her marriage to a cousin because it allows the bride and groom to pool land parcels and capital goods. This decreases land and capital fragmentation and helps to preserve economies of scale and viable land holdings for farming. So the underlying assumption here is that pooling resources with outsiders is costly due to imperfect land market in developing countries. And this is very essential for my model. Um, in many developing countries, more than 50–60% of land parcels are transferred just through inheritance, not markets. And that shows that is an evidence for imperfect capital markets. So from female inheritance, we get to cousin marriage because it helps with economies of scale, right? Then when it comes to female economic participation, there are two lines of literature leading to this studying this effect. For example, anthropologists, they noticed that in societies that we have cousin marriage, high cousin marriage, there are much stricter gender norms. For example, women's attendance in society, social, economic participation. And the idea is that if you want your daughter to marry a cousin, you should be very careful about her relationships. It might lead to marriage with outsiders. So you put more restrictions on your daughters. That is anthropological literature. In economic literature, female inheritance is an unearned income. An unearned income leads to an income effect and reduces women's economic participation. And this is especially true about blue collar jobs, for example, women working in agriculture, because women in these societies work in agriculture as secondary labor of the family, because the work environment is not pleasant for women, especially that there is a social stigma against women's participation in such jobs, because it lowers the social status of the family. So as soon as they have another source of income or a little bit negotiation power in the family due to female inheritance, they leave that job, and that reduces female economic participation in these societies.
All right then. So it is an inheritance income effect. If you are exposed to a lump sum, you are less likely to work. Is this what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. An inherited wealth tends to grow slowly. It dissipates over time. Most of the wealthy people in America today actually accumulated their wealth via their own productive efforts.
Yeah, that's true, but not in developing countries. It is as important as medieval Europe. When we talk about India, about Middle Eastern countries, Africa, land is still the main source of wealth and main form of property in these countries.
Developing countries, many of them are yet to attain impersonal trust. Markets are not unique to the Western world, but in the Western world, markets are based on impersonal trust. The social system evolved to facilitate large-scale partnerships. So Africans had markets prior to colonialism, but many of these markets were based on kinship structures.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
And when
it comes to land, we have inheritance, just transfer of land from fathers to descendants, that I'm not sure we can call that even market. So it is just an imperfect land market.
And another problem in developing countries is that when power is concentrated in a small circle, people are less motivated to work because they assume that success is dependent on luck. And as such, they're more likely to demand regulations, and these regulations negatively affect future business formation.
True, yeah.
It is called, why doesn't capital flow to poor countries? Many societies in the developing world today are like this. If you assume that your success is contingent on the people you know, it's highly unlikely that you're going to be a productive worker. So there's a book written by someone called Kenneth Carter, titled "Why Won't Jamaicans Work?" Jamaica is known for low levels of productivity. And the book is interesting because Kenneth Carter notes that in the Jamaican context, performance does not necessarily impact compensation. Workers assert that their successful colleagues do well because of their ability to transmit gossip to the boss or engage in illicit activities.
That totally makes sense for me.
Yeah, and this book was written several years ago, but even today, when I speak to people on an anecdotal level, this is still a problematic issue. Employees will say it. That person is in a job because he knows the boss, or because he knows someone who slept with the boss, or he's a friend of someone who knows the boss. It's all about the employee's relationship to the boss.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Yeah, and Duman, there are even too many anecdotal examples of people who say, I was working at X corporation and my performance reviews were good. I was a productive person, yet my contract was not renewed. Why was it not renewed? Well, I wasn't a very friendly person.
Oh, okay, yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah,
it's a really complicated issue. But we're going
that's
to continue
interesting.
to talk about your paper. And if you want, I can say more about Jamaica. I think Jamaica is understudied.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, if you want data on trust, if you really want to confirm the relationship between trust and economic performance, Jamaica is an
Mhm.
excellent case study.
That's interesting. Yeah, I will be looking that up.
So, but we're going to continue to talk about your paper. So, women inherit a lump sum
Uh-huh.
from a relative, but male relatives still have a say in assets being transferred to women. Why is this the case?
Um, Actually, when you have laws, that's not the case. So consider, for example, Middle Eastern countries. The Sharia Islamic law requires the inheritance to be divided between sons and daughters. And there isn't much that men can do because that's just a law, right? But what men can do is to control the marriage of their sisters and daughters. By controlling marriage, they control where this partial of inheritance or land will end up, whether at the hands of a stranger or a cousin, right? So when you have this exogenous imposition of inheritance laws to this patriarchal culture, they might not be able to control inheritance, but they can control marriage, right? And that leads to these backlash that we see in terms of cousin marriage, constrained marriage norms, and gender norms.
Compelling. Duman, there's a paper on patriarchy. I don't remember the name of the person who
Hmm.
wrote the paper, but I was having the conversation with a previous guest, and we
Hmm.
both contend that in a modern society,
Hmm.
patriarchy can actually favor women because it selects for productive traits that are expressed by women and it selects against traits that are normally concentrated in male communities. So for instance,
Yeah.
brawn versus brain. We're living in a post-industrial society. Soft skills are important. Major corporations are promoting collaboration. Women are more
Hmm.
sociable than men. Secondly, in a patriarchal society, it is posited that men ought to work in order to secure resources for their family. However, if a male student drops out of school or decides that he's not going to attend university, he will be punished by the labor market. So in the long term, some of these patriarchal norms are actually favoring women because women are socialized to be passive and follow instruction and study. They can study because their job is not necessarily to be a breadwinner. Men are expected to be the breadwinner, so they don't go to school and it hurts them in the long run. But this is
That is
for
interesting.
modern societies, not Asian
Not
societies.
developing countries. Yeah, yeah.
Not
So
not
that
Asian
could
societies, for modern societies.
right. Yeah, I would like to see the evidence for that.
Yes, it was done
Some
by
long-run
someone
trend.
in the East. The researcher is not European.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm not aware of that research,
Yeah,
so I can't talk
but
about that.
even in Jamaica, again, I haven't. There's no research of this nature for Jamaica, but the narrative is that boys are to
Yeah.
work in order to fend for their families. But we do have data on the enrollment of males and females. So in school at the primary level, girls are more likely to be students. And this is not new. It was even the case in the 1940s. At the university level, girls are also more likely to be students. And you can access the data from UA, the university in Jamaica. Jamaica also has the highest percentage of female managers at 59%, and during a
Mm,
recession, male graduates are likely to drop out.
that's interesting.
Yeah, so I would define Jamaica as somewhat patriarchal. So when patriarchal norms are stronger in a modern society, it seems that men are at a disadvantage.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I tell you, Jamaica is an understudied topic. Duman, you're
Yeah,
also known for your research on kinship intensity. You
yeah.
and your co-authors have published several papers on the topic. What is kinship
Mhm.
intensity? And this paper is also related to kinship intensity.
So yeah, it is kind of because one of the elements of kinship intensity is cousin marriage. So we define cousin in kinship intensity with 5 elements, and this is based on the anthropological literature. One is whether you are allowed to marry your cousins or not. The second element is polygyny, whether you can have several wives or not. Third is co-residence with extended family, whether you live with your parents and grandparents at the same house or not. And the fourth element is lineage organization. Lineage organization, I explained that a little bit. For example, whether the lineage organization is patrilineal, you identify yourself by only one side of the family, father's side, versus bilateral, where you identify yourself with both father and mother's side. And community organization, where you have endogamy, you marry only people from the same community. So with these 5 components, we define kinship intensity. And we argue that kinship intensity leads to lower social capital in terms of, say, high corruption or lower trust, lower cooperation. And in several publications, along with my co-authors, we explore that relationship.
Duman, so when scholars appear on the show, I like to give them some homework. And I've been following the works of people like yourself, Henrich, and Jonathan. I am yet
Yeah.
to see a study looking at the relationship between exogamy and innovation. Is there a
Yeah.
link?
Yeah, actually, we're doing that. We're working on that in a new paper that will be out in a couple of weeks. So there we define, well, endogamy and exogamy is just part of the kinship intensity. And there we show some evidence that low kinship intensity is linked to higher innovation, which makes sense, right? If you marry outsiders, you have more cooperation and trust to strangers, it will increase innovation. And we provide some evidence for that. There is definitely a link there.
Exactly. I've been saying this for a long time, and I was introduced to the concept by doing research on the Igbo people of Nigeria, because the Igbo people of Nigeria are known for entrepreneurship and migrating. And for a long time, they were married to people outside of the immediate tribe or our group. So I was
Yeah.
wondering if there's a relationship between exogamy and innovation. It's just like the European marriage pattern.
Hmm.
Europeans were employed in the homes of people they didn't know well, and usually they were also compelled to migrate to to secure employment. So I'm wondering if over time this would have selected for innovation and maybe even intelligence under some
Yeah.
circumstances.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. More relationships with outsiders, more diverse social environment, it will lead to higher innovation.
and and impersonal trust. This is also one of your areas of
Yes,
research.
we also have that on the science paper. Yeah, we have the impersonal trust there as well. So I usually in my presentations and seminar presentations, I give this extreme example of high kinship intensity, how that impacts your social relationships. So it is cousin marriage, polygyny, co-residence, and lineage organization, right? Let's just combine them. Suppose you live in a family where your parents are just cousins, and you and your siblings, you all marry your cousins. And then your father has several wives, and they are also kind of related. And you have all these half siblings, they also marry within the same community from cousins and the same village, and you all live in a big household, close together. And in such an environment, this is an extreme case, right? But it can give us some it can tell us the relationship there. So in such an environment, you are much less likely to meet strangers, to cooperate with strangers, right? And therefore, you will have lower generalized trust, lower level of cooperation with strangers, and that has some um, political economy outcomes. For example, uh, if you find a governmental job, you tend to bring your cousins and your family members to that job, and that creates nepotism because you feel obliged to favor them in cause of others, right? In low kinship intensities, it is just the opposite of that. So that is an extreme example that I usually use to say how these kinship elements impact political economy.
And the kinship intensity affects impersonal trust, and impersonal trust affects third party punishment.
Right,
Westerners are more likely to exhibit third party punishment because they're they're individualistic, as Enrich said
right.
in his book. I'm just paraphrasing him, but in the West, if your neighbor is problematic, this is the problem of the community. Whereas in other societies, people tend to mind their own business. So whenever,
Mhm.
I'm not an American, but as someone who's usually observing America, I'm often dumbfounded by the ability of these people to care so much about the minute details of their neighbor's home. They call the police.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, exactly.
it's a culture shock if you're not a Westerner. I consider myself to be
Right,
a bit individualistic, but I'm also introverted and usually I like to mind my own business.
right.
So
Yeah, yeah. And in Western societies, people usually rely on formal institutions. In high kinship intensity, of course, the first thing that you will rely is your family members. And you can see that in some of the economic variables. For example, the money that you lend in Western countries, the high proportion is just banks, right? Even they don't lend from their father, they just go to banks and financial institutions. In high kinship intensity countries, it is mostly extended family. They lend the money from extended family, and it is just based on trust within this small towns in kinship group.
exactly. So in the Caribbean, it's called susu. In Jamaica, we call it partner. So partner is an informal financial mechanism, and its roots are in Africa. The Igbos, they have a similar system, and some of Jamaica's slaves were
Mhm.
taken from Igbo land. But what I've recognized about the susu, or what we in Jamaica call partner, is that it doesn't scale. So someone is not going to start a partner system and then it will transform into a multinational financial corporation or a local financial corporation. It remains
Mhm.
at the community level. Whereas in America and Europe, there are many examples of really small businesses scaling.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It totally makes sense to me.
Yeah, but some of the financial institutions, to be responsive to the local market, they have designed similar systems.
Mhm.
This is actually one of the reasons why West Indian immigrants did so well in the US in the 1920s, informal financial networks.
Yeah, makes sense to me.
But Duman,
Mhm.
please tell us a little bit more about the relationship between kinship intensity and corruption.
So yeah, that is something that was kind of based on my experience as well, because so I moved from Iran to Canada, and one of the things that strike me in Canada is that how people are impartial in formal and bureaucratic settings. Um, we Middle Easterns usually um, tend to favor our kin groups, cousins, friends, and family members over strangers when it comes to, say, for example, hiring people or cooperating with them. So, and you can actually see that, that cultural difference between Asian societies and Western societies, for example. that in Asian societies, in Middle Eastern countries, you kind of feel this obligation to favor your kin when it comes to your kin group, whether siblings or cousins. And that intersection, the intersection of kinship relations and bureaucratic relations, that intersection creates corruption or nepotism. Therefore, it is likely that in high kinship intensity regions, we will see high corruption and nepotism. We studied that with data in one of our papers that shows in countries with high kinship intensity, with high cousin marriage, for example, we see high level of corruption. And we even identify that within a country. We go to Italy and compare Italian provinces. And we find that in Italian provinces with historically high cousin marriage rates, we see high level of corruption and nepotism. And these are mostly southern Italian provinces. And we show evidence based on cross-country and within country that cousin marriage is linked to corruption and nepotism. Of course, then some might argue that the relationship goes other way around, right? That these societies are developed, they have good institutions, and that leads to low cousin marriage. So maybe it is economic development that leads to low cousin marriage, and that creates this relationship that you're finding. There's definitely some truth in it. Institutions and welfare that impacts kinship relations. Of course, it makes sense, right? In developed countries, institutionally and economically, family is not that important just because they can rely on institutions and government. It totally makes sense. There is some truth in it. But if you look at anthropological and historical evidence, there are more deep-rooted and historical differences in kinship patterns around the world. Even before industrialization, we see some differences in kinship and marriage pattern of Western societies and other societies in terms of cousin marriage, polygyny, and other variables. And that probably created some long-run historical impact on political economy of these societies.
No, I'm going to give an example from Jamaica. So in Jamaica, they don't say give me a bly because it is communicated in Jamaican patois. They say give me a bly. So this is what the Americans would call cutting someone some slack. Let's say that the interview is at 8 a.m., but you show up at 9 or 10. You are given a bly, or you committed an infraction, but due to the relationship between the person who committed the infraction and the individual in a position of power, the former is given a bly. And many
Yeah,
have argued that this leads to corruption, and it's quite obvious. If you're always giving someone a bly, what does that mean? The institution is inefficient.
it's inefficient. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's
So yeah,
inefficient.
it's about, yeah, exactly. So corruption is just one indicator of inefficient or low efficient institutions. That totally makes sense to me.
And the low trust and the high corruption will increase the cost of doing business. So I don't know about American
Oh yeah, exactly.
financial requirements, but to open up a bank, well, I have a colleague who I travel, but my colleague he traveled recently, and he said that the requirements are not as onerous. But to open up a bank account in Jamaica, it is not enough to just provide your passport or a government ID. These people want a reference from a pastor or justice of the peace.
Yeah. Yeah,
What?
exactly. Yeah, that is the case. For example, consider that makes sense. For example, consider entrepreneurship and businesses. So instead, in the United States, in a Western country, you can hire anyone that is a good fit for that job and receives the lowest wage, for example. That is very efficient for the business, right? You find the best match to that job. But if you're in a Middle Eastern country, in a developing country where you mostly rely on kinship, who you're going to hire? You're going to hire someone within your kin relations, right? And if you're just relying on kin relations, the pool of people that you can hire from, it is much smaller than, say, the labor market of the country, right? And that person might actually have low productivity. That person might not be the best match to your business. You're just hiring him because you don't trust others, right? And that lowers the productivity of that business. So there are some data showing that the productivity of family businesses are much lower than the productivity of non-family businesses, which makes sense, right? Instead of finding the best match, highest productive employee, you just find the one with closer family relationships and kin relationships, and you can take that to other settings. It is everywhere. It will reduce the productivity.
Let me give another example in
Mhm,
relation to corruption and how corruption can increase the cost of doing business and waste time. So
mhm,
originally in Jamaica, if you lost your if you lost your phone, one would
yeah,
go to a telephone company to get a new phone and retain its older number. I had one phone for 5 years. Then I went to my cousin's graduation. Rain. I have a Nokia phone, one of the old Nokia phones. Well, I have a Nokia phone, no, but the previous phone was also a Nokia phone. So I was at my cousin's graduation and it
uh-huh,
rained and poured, and my phone encountered water. So unfortunately, it died. It's useless. So I
yeah,
purchased another phone. But then one day I left my phone in an office. I didn't see it, so I said, okay, then I no longer own this phone. It's missing. Therefore, I decided to approach my telephone operator. I
uh-huh,
went to the establishment and was told that to retain my previous number, I had to provide a receipt. And this receipt was actually the receipt for the time when I bought the original phone. They
mhm,
want system fraud or scamming or whatever, but it is just time consuming. So when you live in
yeah,
a low trust society, doing business is infuriating. Recently, I wanted to wire some funds to a foreign account because the stock market in Jamaica is pre-turnout and I don't like low potential companies. So I decided to sign on to this foreign platform to get some foreign instruments. I
right,
got
yeah,
money from an organization in the States for business reasons not related to my personal business.
mhm,
The money is, well, not the money, but the reason for the funds is listed on the account. I can't see, but the teller was able to see it. I went to the bank. Oh, and I must tell you, I waited 3 hours before getting anything done. So I went to the bank,
yeah,
and this young lady, she looks at my account and she says, X amount of money came from Y business in the United States. And I
mhm,
said, okay, the money's on the account. So why are you still bothering me? I'm easily annoyed. The money's on the
right,
account. I did not have a smartphone at the time. I had to borrow a smartphone from this lady to show our boss 2 emails, and then I emailed the 2 emails to the boss before I could get anything done. And I wasted several hours of my time, and I don't like to waste time. So when you live in
yeah.
a low trust country, oh my God, it is just so infuriating.
Yeah, I understand that because I came from such a country. But one thing that I should note here is just that the low trust is an issue, a big problem in many societies, but not all of them are due to high kinship intensity. So I don't have any information about Jamaica in
Yeah,
particular.
exactly. That
I don't
Jamaica
know. I
will
don't know
continue.
what percentage of that low trust is due to high kinship intensity. We don't know that, and we measure the impact of kinship on um, generalized trust, for example. That explains, say, 20-30% of low generalized trust. So the rest of that variation in generalized trust comes from other factors. Economists would know that, but general readers usually When you talk about the impact of one factor, they tend to think that that factor explains everything, which is not the case, right?
Duman, excellent point. Jamaica does not have a history of clans or kin groups, but it's a tribal society. There's tribalism in
Mm,
politics, serious tribalism in entertainment. Well, the tribalism in entertainment has been diluted somewhat. But years ago, when I was like a toddler, people literally fight because
yeah.
of differences due to entertainment. So one person would like X artist and someone preferred another artist and would create a literal fight or lead to gang wars and school students would fight each other. So there's an facility in Jamaica that made the country famous for producing athletes. Colloquially,
Yeah.
we call it champs. Champs is peaceful today, but at one point it was rather violent. School rivalry led to actual violence. So for a
Mhm.
society without a history of kinship intensity and clans, it's a bit strange that the country is so tribal. So maybe you and your colleagues should do a genetic study. Jamaicans are from Africa, Yoruba,
Mhm.
the Asante,
Yeah,
all
maybe
of
there
these
is
different,
something
yes,
where,
exactly. Maybe it's
right.
genetic
Yeah. Yeah.
because they were
Maybe,
taken
but
from,
I wouldn't say we don't look the, we don't see genetic as a cause. But as a consequence, we can study that. We're
yes.
kind of doing that in one of our papers. Why? Because in societies with high cousin marriage and high polygyny rates, you expect that runs of homozygosity will be longer, and that will create high inbreeding coefficient. That's a measure in genetic data. So in if you see a high breeding coefficient in a society, it means that their ancestors, they had high kinship intensity. They probably married their cousins or someone within the community for 1,000 years. And that creates this high inbreeding coefficient. So yeah, we can look at genetic data to see the long run impact of that cultural background. And it is that cultural background that creates, say, qualities like low trust or low cooperation. It is not genetic per se.
Okay then, but I would love to see the data before commenting. But Duman, it appears that we're on the same page. When I suggest a new proposal, you say, well, that's what we're working on.
We do, yeah. In 2, 3 weeks, we're gonna have the paper out.
Yeah, so I guess great minds actually do think alike.
Yeah. Yeah, so there we actually see that there is a relationship between high inbreeding coefficient and high kinship intensity. So it means high kinship intensity creates higher inbreeding coefficient. And all these variables are linked to lower economic development.
Okay then. Now you're going to explore the conclusions in your paper co-authored with Jonathan Schultz, Joseph Enrich, and Jonathan How do you is this French? How do you pronounce Jonathan's last name from GMU?
Bouchamp, yeah.
Boucham, okay. The church, intensive kinship, and global psychological variation. Shed some light
Yeah,
on this paper.
we kind of touched on that. So we argue that uh, the differences in kinship intensity that explains psychology of societies. When we look at psychology, for example, we consider individualism. So in low kinship intensity societies, you expect higher individualism. In high kinship intensity, you'll expect higher collectivism, right? Because kinship relations, they rely on these collective norms and obligations, which totally makes sense, right? We look at a range of variables like that. It is individualism, creativity, analytic thinking. For example, this one is interesting. This is based on a triad task, asking people to choose two of the three objects. For example, it says choose two of sheep, rabbit, and carrot, right? If you choose rabbit and carrot, it means you're seeing the larger context where the two are related to each other. Rabbits eat carrots, right? if you're using that, that is what I chose actually the first time I saw it. It means you're from a collectivist society where you have holistic thinking, seeing this larger context of relationships. In many Western societies, most of the people, majority of people choose sheep and rabbit actually.
They're both animals. I would have chosen sheep
They're
and
both
rabbits.
animals. Yeah, okay. So that is analytical thinking. Mostly in individualistic cultures. So we use that measure, for example, for analytical thinking. Then we have Ash conformity, measures for tightness, obedience, importance of tradition, importance of proper behavior. These are things that we would see in collectivist societies, right? And then, for example, we have United Nations diplomatic tickets. This is measuring the tickets that diplomats in New York got. So they come from different countries. They live in the same city. Their salaries are similar, right? And they are exempt from paying tickets, but they get tickets when they, for example, park in forbidden areas. And the measure shows that those from collectivist culture, from high kinship intensity cultures, they are more likely to get tickets. Other measures, for example, we have nepotism, particularism, blood donations, and generalized trust. And we show that high kinship intensity explains higher corruption, lower trust, higher collectivism, and holistic thinking, and other variables. That is one main theme of paper. And then in the paper, we also explore some historical facts for that. I kind of touched on female inheritance, right? So why we see this variation in kinship intensity across the world? Why, for example, the lowest cousin marriage rates are in Western Europe and highest cousin marriage rates are in the Middle East? How we can explain that? For female inheritance kind of explains this high cousin marriage in Middle Eastern societies because Islam requires female inheritance, and that historically created this high cousin marriage rate. But what about Western Europe? Why cousin marriage is low in that region? In the paper, we discussed this and provide some evidence for that. It was mostly the Catholic Church policies, because even before industrialization, going back to 5th century, the Catholic Church banned high kinship intensity practices. For example, they banned cousin marriages, they banned polygyny, and they banned some other stuff. For example, adoption of orphan kids. So anything that increased kinship intensity, Catholic Church would ban. And that historically created this low kinship intensity in Western societies. And we show some evidence that development, this particular type of psychology in Western Europe that is linked to development in this region, it can be traced back to the Catholic Church policies centuries ago.
Yes, the church. What was the terminology again? The church and family marriage program?
Sorry, what was
No,
it?
what's the terminology? What's the terminology invoked to describe it? The church and family marriage program?
Yes, the church, family, and marriage
Yeah,
program.
marriage and family program. Yes, I read Joseph.
Right.
I read his book. Weird.
Right.
All of it. So we're wrapping up, but before we go, briefly comment on this paper, Crops, Kinship, and Female Economic Participation. You're now in the same boat with James B. and he likes to study the relationship between crops and long-term outcomes.
Which paper is that? So say that
Crops,
again.
Kinships, and Female Economic Participation. It's listed on your website as a working paper. I didn't read it, but I'm interested in the relationship between crops and social outcomes.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't talk about that until I have a solid data and evidence for that.
Okay, not a problem, but we can always recount earlier research.
Hopefully
So
in the future.
we can recount earlier research in the
So I can
meantime.
mention some another paper which is published. I can discuss that, which is related to this one. So, for example, there is this paper in Science paper by Talham.
By what's the name of the person?
Talham.
Oh yeah, yeah, I know
He's from
Thomas.
Chicago, right? Yeah, Thomas Alvan, yeah. And he looks at China
Rice,
and
yeah.
different regions like rice cultivating regions versus wheat cultivating regions. And in rice cultivated regions, you see higher collectivism because people need to cooperate with each other. It is labor intensive and it needs irrigation, right? And that leads to collective society. So, and there is a link between collectivism and kinship and marriage. So that we're going to explore that in this new paper. But the idea is from Talton, and he has some evidence for
Yeah,
that, of course.
Thomas has several papers on the topic. There's one paper that's
Yeah,
on my reading list. I make it to complete it, but I'm going to finish it.
yeah,
Yeah.
he's very famous for rice versus wheat societies and exploring that idea on different outcome variables.
Yes, but we're wrapping up now. I'm really enjoying the conversation, Duman, but
Yeah, thank you.
unfortunately
Me
I
too.
have to go. Like I'm really enjoying it, and you can hear it in my voice. I can't hear it in your voice though.
Yeah, thank you. It was very nice
Yeah, it's a
conversation.
pleasure
Thank
to
you.
have you. All right, bye, Duman.
Bye bye. Thanks.